Good afternoon. I'm Pat Kohler, and former director of the Liquor Control Board and now the director of licensing, as indicated earlier. I first want to thank Jason and Jeff and all the folks from ShipCompliant for inviting us here today. I've never been to Napa, so I got a chance to go to William Hill Winery last night. Beautiful country, so thank you for having us here. So no other agency in the state of Washington has ever gone through a major initiative like we did with privatization, but as indicated earlier, like by Lou, we've actually gone through two initiatives in a year's period of time, and it's lucky that we have staff that are quite capable of implementing something as complex as privatization of liquor, but also as complex as marijuana. So Rick and I are going to tag team this presentation today. So in November of 2011, the voters passed Initiative 1183, which was to privatize liquor sales in Washington. What was probably less known to the voters of Washington was that there were significant regulatory changes in the initiative that impacted both wine and liquor. The law required us to simultaneously shut down a $1 billion retail operation for spirits while setting up new policies and systems to regulate the new law. It also resulted in layoffs of over 1,000 employees. So in my career, my 30 years career with the state of Washington, I've never gone through more of an emotional impact. Not only was it a big undertaking to set up a new system and to shut down that operation, but to lay off 1,000 people was pretty emotional. It would be helpful, I think, to give you some history of events before we talk about the impacts of Initiative 1183. In 2004, Costco sued the state, and they were suing us for many of the regulatory changes that they placed into the initiative at that point, not going as far as privatizing our retail operations, but suing us for major regulatory changes. In 2010, there were two attempts to privatize liquor, and those both did not pass, mainly because of public safety concerns and also because liquor was going to be sold basically anywhere in convenience stores, and there were a lot of concerns around children getting access to liquor. The other major issue was the state would lose significant revenue. Because it was run by the state, there was significant amount of revenue that went to fund programs. And depending on the state that you are in, states like California have an income tax, Washington didn't. So what we did was we taxed sin taxes really high. In fact, we're the highest state in the nation related to spirits. So a year after that attempt to privatize, they went at it again with Initiative 1183. And they did things different this time. They invested $22 million into a campaign to fund an initiative. Never in the history of Washington has there been that amount of money put towards an initiative. They also decided that they would apply the initiative only to wine and spirits. They took beer out of the scenario because there was such a strong campaign the previous time about beer, and they thought if they took beer out, they'd get people to approve it. They also required that retailers be at least 10,000 square feet, so they were catering to the large retail model and trying to address concerns around public safety and not allowing convenience stores to operate a liquor store, although there were some loopholes and there are some of smaller locations, which we can cover later. They also set a significant fee at the distributor level and the retail level, and some view that fee as a tax, but they were able to distinguish that as a fee so that the state and locals did not lose money in the process of privatizing. I think in our state, the voters were most attracted to providing more access. So 4 times as many locations that sell spirits today that previous to the monopoly. So there's more accessibility. They wanted lower prices, and they wanted, I think there was this fundamental principle that they wanted government out of the liquor business. The sponsors of the initiative, mainly Costco and the restaurant associations, I think there was an interest in getting into the business so that they could make money off an open competitive marketplace. I think that they also thought they'd get better selection, better service, and they were looking for changes in their business requirements, their business model, so that they could get some opportunities to negotiate, like for volume discounts, to improve pricing to the consumer. So 1 year later, there are significant financial and business impacts to most stakeholders in the spirits and wine businesses, and I'll highlight a few of those. So just quickly, this is just a brief outline of the key dates. I think I just would emphasize a couple things here. The law specified that we had to shut down the operation in less than 6 months, and basically by June 1st we had to be up and running. So we just hit a key milestone, which is 1 year ago we privatized. So here are some of the key regulatory changes. As I indicated earlier, Costco sued the state in 2004, and these were the major changes that they were looking for. The only regulatory change they won in the lawsuit was for price, post, and hold. And after that, our legislature looked at what kinds of regulatory changes could we make to the system. And so there were some things that resulted in money's worth and financial interests and the minimum markup changes. But that's all through a negotiated process in the legislature. And I think it is interesting to note that, for example, in Pennsylvania, in order for them to be privatized, they have to go through a legislative process that requires negotiations. In an initiative process, there isn't really a negotiations. The writers can write it whatever the way they want, and as long as they get enough signatures to get it on the ballot, they can actually get it passed. So this slide shows many of the regulatory changes. I think for those of you from California, most of you already have these regulatory changes in California, with the exception of retail-to-retail sales. So you can see uniform pricing, the ban on quantity discounts, the ban on central warehousing, and the ban on retail-to-retail sales was repealed under the new law. I think that the retail-to-retail sales is a major change in the way people do business. So in other words, off-premise retailers can now sell to on-premise. They did try to put in there a limit to 24 liters. The board tried to limit that to a per day, but recently the courts overturned that, and there's still a discussion on whether or not there'll be appeal on that. But these are the major changes. The taxes stayed intact. So remember earlier I said we are the highest tax state in the nation. So that stayed in place, and then the fees were added on top of it, and so that really did have an impact to the prices that people pay for liquor in the state. I think that that was one of the areas where it's really confusing to the voter because they view those fees as taxes. So this is the new regulatory model that's created under 1183, which is much different than the traditional three-tier model that we had in our state. The normal three-tier model is that you go from the producer through the distributor to the retailer, and the retailer sells to the consumer. Now, in Washington, the wine was different. Wine did have some of the paths that were created under Initiative 1183. For example, they could bypass a distributor, sell directly to the retailer and to the consumer. The interesting thing is, even though the initiative gave all these different paths for them to bypass the distributor, because of the way suppliers dealt with, especially in the spirit side, dealt with the marketplace, 90% plus are going through a distributor today. So really it just shifted from a state monopoly to a private monopoly in the distributor level, because most of the spirits are going through a distributor level today. So for distillers, in our state, the in-state distillers are allowed to sell on their own product to retailers as well as to distributors and direct to the consumer at their distillery. Now, in-state distilleries are limited to 2 liters per day. An out-of-state distiller can sell directly to both the distributor and retailer, which previously did not exist. For distributors, it created a distributor license to sell spirits, and this is where the fees come in place. There's a 10% fee, and then after 2 years it goes to a 5% fee. In addition to that, they pay an annual license fee of $1,320. One of the key things in the law, which was to generate a lot of revenue for the state, was they were looking for the distributors that held a distributor license to pay $150 million in the first year. Kind of a pay-to-play. Basically, if you were a distributor and you were going to get in this business, you were going to pay the state $150 million. And if there was a shortfall, that would be based on their sales, and if there was a shortfall, they would have to make that up and pay that by May 31st of 2013. So in this case, we recently went through the details of that, and it was actually $105 million short. So the distributors had to make that up, the largest distributor paying $59 million as a result of this $150 million requirement. Distributors can buy from in and out-of-state distilleries, importers, foreign spirit suppliers, and another distributor, and they can sell to another distributor or a retailer. Retailers. Some significant changes for the retailers. The law created that they had to be at least 10,000 square feet unless they were a former state store that was auctioned off, or they were a contract store or a tribal store, or finally, if the board defined a trade area in which there was no other spirit location, they could actually have an exception to 10,000 square feet. So there are cases in Washington in which convenience stores do run a liquor store. They're required to pay a 17% fee on all their spirit sales, and that fee never changes and never goes away. They also pay a $166 annual fee. Some interesting stats here is there's 1,400 retailers now that sell spirits in Washington. Previously, under the monopoly, there were about 350 locations, so 4 times as many locations under the new system. The auctioning off of state stores, when the initiative writers wrote the law, they thought we owned the buildings, and we didn't, so we created this auctioning of a right to run a liquor store. And to our surprise, it made $31 million. The problem is that these small businesses really didn't understand that there would be this open competitive marketplace and that they would have to compete against Costco's and Safeway's and Fred Meyer's. And so many of them are struggling. Many of them have closed their doors because they can't make it. And so that's caused a significant impact to small business. Also, when you look at the retail-to-retail sales, the 17% applies. Even though they're selling to a restaurant, they still have to pay the 17%. And so many of the small contract stores that thought they didn't have to pay that ended up having to pay that fee, and it caused them to not be competitive with the larger retailers. It is generating more money, so the state is making more money over privatization. Once the $150 million flattens out, it ends up being about $40 to $60 million more a year to have the state privatized because there is more sales. The state is paying higher prices for liquor, and some will blame taxes on that, but it is the combination of the taxes and the fees. For an off-premise retailer, they're paying about 11% higher, and licensees restaurants, they're paying about 9% higher in prices for liquor on average across all products. So the retailers did get some business practices that they wanted. Uniform pricing no longer exists, so they can negotiate their price. And we've had some challenges with that, with things called family plans and people trying to get creative about giving different pricing for a restaurant versus a large retailer or one of these contract stores, even though their volume is higher. Restaurants are getting a better price, and so it's caused some investigations by the state to look into those issues. Quantity discounts are allowed now, so people can negotiate based on volume. And central warehousing, which fits really well to large organizations like Costco or Safeway, where they want to bring their product into a warehouse and then distribute it out themselves. So retail to retail sales, one of the things the board tried to do, because there was this 24-liter limit and it wasn't very clear in the law, it said 24 liters per transaction. The board did try to define by law that that would be a per day limit, but as I indicated earlier, that was overturned. But the sales are subject to the fees, and For wine, it's possible through the addition of the reseller endorsement that you can get that added to your grocery store license. And for spirits, it's included in your new spirits license. So I want to conclude with this about some of the lessons that we've learned 1 year later from the privatization of liquor. And I think it kind of fits into three kind of buckets. One is pre-1183, what could we have done differently? The initiative process itself, and then post-1183, what are some of the business impacts? In the area of pre-1183, I think that some of the things we look at is, could we have modernized sooner and looked at ways to have been more progressive, even possibly looking at transitioning or phasing out, putting liquor stores in grocery stores, better communication about our business. The regulatory changes are oftentimes complicated for people to understand, but could we have done more communications? I think part of the challenges that we struggled with were really twofold. One was getting stakeholders to buy in to the changes that we wanted to make, especially like the unions, because they were concerned about losing employees, and in the end they did. But also legislative funding. In government, we have to really put together a pretty strong business case, work all the politics to get funding, and so that was some of the struggles there. I would say that the liquor business is very complex, and stakeholders are all over the place as to where they stand on an issue. And in this case, nobody wanted to compromise. Costco didn't want to compromise, so they sued us. And then when they didn't get that, they ended up going through the initiative process because they didn't want to compromise through the legislature. The union didn't want to compromise because they didn't want to lose employees. The distributors didn't want to compromise because they wanted to maintain the business. So in the end, I think a higher level of compromise definitely would have helped. The initiative process itself had its flaws, and it did create a lot of problems for us. We had to interpret things, like we had to define what trade area meant, and the board chose to narrowly focus it. It probably would have helped to have had a longer transition time. But I will share with you, even the writers of the initiative didn't get everything they wanted, because this is a pretty complex business, and they didn't fully understand what the current law did and what changes what kind of impacts those changes would have. We're involved in 11 lawsuits as a result of Initiative 1183, and so we're dealing with those today. The writers are suing us. And the distributors for the $150 million, landlords, contract stores, the list goes on of the number of people that are suing over the initiative. And even though the state didn't write it, it becomes a law, so the state has to represent it. Some of the business impacts that I'll share with you, from a winery standpoint, I think a lot of the regulatory changes wineries were already operating under, but I think that there were definitely impacts. It had a huge disruption to the distribution network. Trying to focus on getting spirits on the shelf in such a short time, I think caused an impact to the wineries in getting shelf space. So what the stores have done is they're probably having the same amount of space to liquor itself, but so what that creates is less space for wine and beer. I think less advertising, because they're advertising for spirits, less retail displays. So it has had that kind of business impact out there. I think that one of the things that's happening too, though, is there are some of these big mega stores coming in, even much larger than Costco, because they sell large amount of products but very narrowly focused. Stores like Bevmo and Total Wine have moved into the state, which carries a huge selection of wine, spirits, and beer, which I think is a good thing for selection for the citizens of the state. But there are pricing practices that are going on when a large retailer is trying to use loss leaders to get a product out the door, to get the consumer in the door and sell products. I think it is causing some diminishing of value of the brand in some consumers' eyes. So we've heard from some of the wineries concerns about the loss leader and the impact that it has to the brands. The small businesses in Washington that were in the liquor business are definitely struggling. There probably are as many as 55 of the existing 350 contract and state stores that either never open their doors or close their doors shortly thereafter. So, and I think the key is there's no longer a level playing field, so they have to compete in this open marketplace, and it's not an environment they were used to competing in. Prices are up, and I shared that earlier, the impacts there. And then finally, theft. The businesses are having to deal with much more theft than we did in our liquor stores. And I think part of it is a learning experience for them. A lot of them were placing products right at the doorway where kids thought, oh, well, this is fun. I'll just run out the door. And they have a policy that they don't chase after them. So we've had to deal with a lot of concerns from law enforcement around theft and youth access to liquor. So that concludes my remarks, and we'll save questions to the end, and I'll turn it to Rick. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good to be here. Just a couple things before I jump into my subject that I wanted to share along with Pat. Just maybe a summation when you think about lessons learned from 1183 and the privatization of wine and spirits, obviously spirits in Washington. I think there's a great level of frustration by all three tiers because what they thought they were getting and what they got is very much different. I'll give you an example. Obviously, when Costco sued in 2004 and then went to the legislature to seek changes in 2008, what they were really looking for were the regulatory pieces. The Costco model is what, as we all know, it's to purchase in bulk from a supplier and then provide great value to their customers. And the system that we had for alcohol beverage did not allow that. So very, very quickly what it did was, which doesn't work for the Costco model, if you have uniform pricing, and I'm a winery in California or Washington, what did I have to do in Washington was sell to Costco and the small grocer at the same price. Now, obviously, that doesn't work in the Costco model or any box retailers because obviously the ability to get volume discounts and give the customer a better deal is the way it's always worked. I think the frustration with that is their belief was through the initiative process, suppliers would then be able to sell direct to Costco. And in fact, the law provides that. But what's happening today is probably 95% or more of the spirits that's being sold in Washington is going through a distributor. So the reality of what occurred is suppliers were reluctant to sell direct because of the contracts that they hold with those suppliers in the 49 other states. And so the reality is I think Costco's frustrated by the fact that it's not working for them. The distributors were frustrated because in order to hold the license for a year, you had to pay $150 million up front in order to get into the business. So there was a frustration with respect to distributors. If you're a small grocery store or a small contract store or state store that was converted to a spirit retail license, you can't compete with a large competition with respect to large grocers because what are they now doing that wasn't there before? They're purchasing in bulk. These small grocers have no purchasing power, so many of them are struggling. And while the taxes remain the same, these fees that were imposed, if you can imagine a 10% distributor, I guess a B&O tax, a tax at 10%. Just think if you were a wine distributor or a wine retailer and you were paying those kind of fees, a 17%, basically a tax, a 17% fee on your gross sales every quarter, and then a 10% fee on your gross sales if you're a distributor. The reason why many of these small retailers have gone out of business is because not only are they paying the taxes, and this is quite different, as you know, than beer and wine. These spirit retailers are actually paying the taxes that were typically collected by the state or collected at the supplier or distributor tier. They're paying the taxes and they're paying that 17% fee. So many of them are struggling. Now, if you're a Costco or a Safeway or a large box store, obviously you've got more in that store than just spirits. So those that are simply liquor stores are struggling under that. So I just wanted to share the results after a year of mixed There's certainly more convenience than there was before, but I think the irony is that the prices they're higher than they were before. So think about the fact that we spent a year, and in June 1st of this last year, the first retail stores opened up, kind of tearing down a $1 billion business. The voters really, I think, were more concerned about what Pat said, which was, we don't really believe it's appropriate for the state to be involved in the sale of alcohol. And I think that's going to be a struggle for many states like Pennsylvania, where in our state people come from all over. They basically come from open states, California, Arizona, where citizens are used to being able to go into a grocery store and buying spirits, beer, and wine. So I think that's one of the things over time that changed what happened in Washington, is because so many people from open states moved into our state. But, you know, the voters through this initiative process, and you see it here on the West Coast, do the darndest things. And so while they, at 1-2 years before, take the state away from selling spirits, what do they do 2 years later but have the liquor board create a regulatory system, which is fascinating because it's set up, like our alcohol beverage law, to create grower, processor, and retail licenses. So I'll cover very quickly. For somebody that's been involved in public policy for 30 years, I worked in the House for 5 years and in the State Senate for 8 years and was a policy director for the board before I became the deputy director. Can you imagine anything more fascinating than being involved in alcohol beverage law and then someone putting an initiative together that says, hey, we kind of like the way you set up the system, even though we kicked you out a part of it, but what we'd like to do now is have you set up the system to properly regulate marijuana in our state. So very quickly, really like Colorado, and I think one of the things that surprised us was nowhere in the world have they done this. I think we looked and we thought, well, I thought Amsterdam, I thought Holland, I thought these places in Europe have been regulating and taxing and selling drugs for years, including cannabis and marijuana. No, they haven't. What they've done in those countries and in those states is they've decriminalized it. They've not created systems to regulate the sale and then tax it and create revenue for the country or the state. Actually, Allison Holcomb, who's an ACLU policy director in Washington that authored I-502, was just in Uruguay, because Uruguay, believe it or not, is looking at regulating and taxing marijuana. But really for Colorado and for Washington, it's really the world's first comprehensive system for regulating marijuana. And our timelines are very similar to Colorado. They're going to actually, I believe, have their rules in place by July 1st. We spend an hour or two with them about every 10 or 14 days, just learning from one another as we set up our systems. But really what happened initially on December 6th was possession of 1 ounce of marijuana, 16 ounces of a solid form, edibles, and 72 ounces in the liquid form were decriminalized. And what we were asked to do was create, and really, much like our 3-tiered tight house laws, and the fascinating thing, I'm not sure why they did it that way, but if I'm a producer or a processor license, I can't hold a retail license. So I can't have any direct or indirect interest between the retailer and the producer and processor, which is, as you all know, very similar to the tight house laws that you have in this state and in many states. There are really high taxes placed upon this, and I think part of the campaign to get marijuana legalized in Washington was the revenue that would be collected. So actually 25% levels of taxation at the producer, the processor, and the retail level. B&O and local taxes apply. There's been an estimate by the governor's Office of Financial Management, which is why there was a large segment of people that voted for it, given the fiscal crisis in Washington, that we could collect as much as $2 billion in revenue over 5 years when fully operated, about $500 million in revenue a year. Really, the campaign did a pretty great job of speaking to the whole issue of public safety, incarceration, the dollars that were used by citizens for corrections, and felt that marijuana was so much a part of the state that we should legalize it. And if you go to I-502 website and take a look at some of their ads, which I didn't bring, you'll see they were pretty successful, not only in raising money to run the campaign, but probably what helped a lot was, and it's really kind of odd, very little money, if none, to oppose the campaign. So it established THC levels for marijuana DUIs, believe it or not, of 5 nanograms, which is why the medical marijuana community opposed the initiative, because that wasn't in the law. It establishes limits for the board for store locations, advertising, the number of outlets, very similar to the liquor system that we had under spirits, and earmarks revenue to healthcare research and education. And really the only requirement in the law was that the board establish these rules by December 1st. So really the role and the objective of the agency is to create a tightly controlled and regulated marijuana market. And there's other reasons for doing that I'll talk about. But like I said, it creates a 3-tier system, creates licenses for producers, processors, and retailers. Much like we do for liquor, we have marijuana enforcement officers that we'll be hiring this year that will look for compliance with respect to those 3 licenses. We'll be collecting taxes and fees. And as I said earlier, comparing notes with Colorado. There's really 3 pieces to the rules that I'll go through very quickly, because I'm guessing that you have questions on the other issues that were before the panel. But I talked about earlier, the only system that's out there that regulates marijuana was Colorado, as you all know, for medical marijuana. And so that's another reason that we spent a lot of time with Colorado and looked at some of the systems that they put in place. So it's likely for 30 days we'll open up a window where folks can apply for a license as a producer, processor, and retailer. There's actually state residency requirements of 3 months to apply. In Colorado, it's 2 years. Very similar to liquor, they use the same statutes with respect to background checks, criminal background checks, and fingerprinting. There's actually a point system that we use for liquor. If you apply, if you had some legal violations or issues with respect to crimes, so there is some, I would say, flexibility around that, knowing that what we're trying to do is move people in the illicit market who are in medical marijuana industry over to our recreational system. You actually have to provide an affidavit from the landlord that the landlord's aware if you get a lease or you rent property that a marijuana licensee will be there. And you also have to provide an affidavit that you're current with your state and local taxes in order to meet the requirements. With respect to public safety, we have indoor and outdoor grows that are allowed. If it's an outdoor grow, there's a requirement for an 8-foot fence. I won't go into the details of that, but the idea is for it to be secure. Actually going to use, we have an RFP that's going to go out in a couple of weeks to create a traceability model, a software that anyone who holds a license would have to have with the board. So we'll actually trace it from seed through the 3 tiers to the consumer. And almost like an apple, where you can tell where that apple was grown, it will be the same with usable marijuana in Washington. Violation guidelines. We have standard penalty guidelines, as you all know. If you hold a license in Washington, we've created the same thing for marijuana. I talked a little bit about security. There are advertising restrictions. You can't advertise within 1,000 feet of a school, of a park, of a library. The city of Seattle did a map on retail locations that would be available if you place that 1,000-foot restriction, and there are very few locations. So it's actually, there are some things that are flawed in the initiative. One of them is that it's going to be difficult to put a retail location in Seattle given the 1,000-foot restriction. And then the board has to determine by county the number of retail locations. As far as consumer safety, because the feds aren't involved in this, and we'll talk about that in a minute, there's behind the counter storage. We have to actually define the serving sizes, which we've done, and there are strict packaging and labeling requirements. So we're actually in the process of putting those together now. So those are the things that we're doing in setting up the system in Washington, but there are lots of issues and challenges that we don't have any control over. One of them is the federal uncertainty. Our governor and attorney generals, as well as Colorado, has been working with Attorney General Holder and the Department of Justice for them to at least give us some guidance for what they're looking at. But it looks like we're probably not going to get any information from them before we move forward, and we'll continue to move forward. What's another difficulty is medical marijuana marketplace in Washington is not regulated by any agency. So there's actually legislation or a proviso in the budgets in the House and Senate that has the Liquor Control Board, the Department of Health, and the Department of Revenue come back with recommendations to properly regulate and tax medical marijuana, because one of the things that can happen is it's not going to be effective if you've got two competing markets, one regulated and taxed and the other not regulated and taxed. So we were able to convince the legislature that we needed help in order to properly regulate medical marijuana. I suspect in a year or two it will be the Liquor Board that will be issuing licenses under medical marijuana. And then there's a whole issue of banking. So if I want capital in order to become a grower of marijuana, what bank am I going to go to that isn't federally insured? So we're actually working with the Department of Financial Institutions and with the feds to try to get some guidance and some leeway and some flexibility for these growers and processors who need capital up front. And then what do you do with these retail locations, and what do they do with the cash that they have? So that's really not our issue, but we're working with the governor and the feds to see if there's a way to provide that. We know that there are medical marijuana dispensaries in Washington that use banks, but they don't have a license. Will actually the state be granting licenses, which is also obviously going to make it clear that, oh yes, you have a license to grow pot in Washington. So obviously that becomes problematic. Yeah, so one of the, just to end, one of the things that was just fascinating is typically we have a meeting for rules, and we'll get like a handful of people that show up for the meetings. We had so many people that showed up for our meetings that we actually had to go across the state in 8 public forums where we had thousands of people show up to get information or to allow for input before we even got into the rulemaking process. And you're really, really lucky that you missed those meetings. During the day, we'd meet with local governments, we'd meet with law enforcement. Everyone didn't know what to do with this new law. And then we also met with the prevention community. And then at night, for 3 or 4 hours, we had testimony for those who are in the illicit market, those who are in medical marijuana dispensaries, and you wouldn't believe what we saw. But we do have video and audio. They actually lit up joints as they were testifying to the board. They gave the board pot. They actually threw pot on the table and said, this is good and this is bad, but you need to find out how this all works since you're going to be the regulator. And then you got some of our board members who partake or did partake, and we would tell them, you really don't want to talk about this with the media, but it was difficult. So fascinating. Thanks to Jeff and to Jason for giving us the chance to come. I know it really doesn't fit with the wineries, but it's a fascinating thing. I think what you're going to see, I see Oregon, Alaska, California all looking at ballot proposals probably in the next few years. It's going to see how the feds deal with it. Right now, marijuana is considered a Schedule I controlled substance. There's bills that have been introduced. Denny Heck from Washington. There's a congressman from Colorado just in the last few days who introduced legislation to lower it to Schedule II. So it's kind of a fascinating thing. We'll see how it works.
There was an indirect connection to wineries, though. Many of the people that testified in the evening wanted us to treat it similar to how wineries grow grapes and enter into the winery business. They were making that analogy that it was similar to the wine business.
So what we heard in the hearings was we have to do this like we did our cottage wine industry,
Yes.
where small businesses have this, because their fear is RJR, these large corporations are going to come in and try to be the growers, try to get processor. Well, that 3-month residency requirement is causing issues. You actually have to be a resident in order to be named on the application, and so I don't think that's going to happen. But Pat makes a really good point. Time after time in the public hearings, we heard that this should be a small industry, which is really what it is today in the illicit market. Okay, so I think I'm over time, but can I take 1 minute? I probably wouldn't be doing my job as president of NCSLA if I didn't very quickly talk a little bit about our organization. I'm talking about like 60 seconds. There are members here, suppliers, regulators, wineries, too many to name today, that are part of NCSLA, which is the National Conference of State Liquor Administrators. It's a wonderful opportunity. You know, it's interesting that Lou introduced me, because Lou Bright, when he was part of the administration at Texas, and Lynn Walding, when he was part of Iowa, and now with Diageo, got me involved in NCSLA to the point that now I serve as the current president. It's a great organization. It's a great opportunity. We have 41 states that are part of it. It's great networking that occurs with all 3 tiers and the regulators. Unfortunately, we're meeting in Honolulu, Hawaii in a couple of weeks, so just a bummer spot that we're going to be at. Darn. But some of you will be there, I know. But I just wanted to provide an opportunity. Unlike NABCO, it tends to be a trade show, and I don't have an issue with that. This is really an opportunity for folks like yourself who are compliance specialists or work on behalf of wineries to really sit down with the regulator and work through issues, because we do a lot of that while we're there for the few days that we're there. So please, if you're not part of our organization as a winery, take a look at it. It's a wonderful opportunity to network, just like you're doing here today. Again, thank you, Justin and Jeff, for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks, Pat, and thanks, Steve. How many people here are members of NCSLA? Let's see, just real quick, raise a hand. California Wine Institute, Washington, lots of wineries. It's a really great organization. We've been members for 5 years, and I can't say enough good things about NCSLA. I really encourage you to check it out. Rick has been a fantastic president of NCSLA. President gets to choose the location of the annual meeting. And Rick chose, right, didn't I? Yeah, Rick chose Honolulu, and I'm actually moderating a panel there, so I have to go, unfortunately. But that makes sense, because I've been to pretty much all of the meetings, from Fort Worth to Oklahoma City to the 4 corners of the country. I'm usually the only one that goes, but Jason took a look at the agenda this year, and he thought it actually looked really interesting. Yeah. So both of us will be in Hawaii this year. We're going to open it up for questions. Lou, do you have anything you want to kick us off on?
Maybe. Rick, one of the things that struck me as I was listening to you talk is that residency requirements and advertising restrictions are routinely struck down in the liquor world, and I notice you have them in the marijuana regulations. This is probably too early to be asking these questions, but do you have concerns along those lines? Do you think you've crafted them in a way that will survive a constitutional challenge?
Probably not, Lou. So we have residency requirements for liquor in Washington now, but not to the level. Typically what we do for liquor is if you have 10% interest in that license, then you have to be named on the license, and then that gets you into the residency requirements and the background checks. Unfortunately, when they wrote this law, they didn't give us any ability to do that. It just says any member of a corporation, any member would have to provide residency and meet a background check. That's obviously not going to work if Costco or a large corporation is interested in coming into the state, because they could never meet those residency requirements. So I think it's a flaw in the initiative and something that they'll have to look at. But some would say, no, it wasn't a flaw. The intent is for this marketplace to be grown by Washingtonians, for Washingtonians only. And part of the way they did that was to say, basically, nobody from outside the state can hold a license.
One of the things that we'll have an advantage on is that the rules have to be done by December 1st. We don't anticipate retailers opening until March. So we have next legislative session to go back and address some of the key issues that we see flaws with. it'll take a 2/3 vote by the legislature to get a change to the law. But like in medical marijuana, I think there's a huge interest because they put a revisal language in for us to look at that. So we'll be able to have some changes maybe before they actually start running a retail opening for business.
You know, you mentioned that you had put, that Washington has put in our familiar three-tiered structure on the supplier, wholesaler, retailer. Part of that structure, as we all know, is some pretty significant restrictions on what we call marketing practices. The flow of benefits from upper tiers to the retailer, the flow of goods and benefits to retailers to promote sales. Is that in the initiative, or are you thinking about that in your rules?
Well, it's in the initiative.
Okay.
It's actually problematic, though, when you're looking at, in Colorado, there's called a vertical system. In Colorado, for medical marijuana, you can be a grower, a processor, and a retailer. Actually have collective gardens, just like Washington. It's a vertical integrated system. This system is not going to make it easy for those in medical marijuana to come over because they typically have collective gardens. They grow for their patients. That's how that system works. In Colorado, it's going to be a little easier because they're simply going to allow those that have medical marijuana licenses to get a recreational license. So it's going to be problematic for us to bring the medical marijuana industry in because it's not vertically integrated.
Now for something completely different, my friend Mr. Botting has a question.
I was just wondering, on that question of the three-tier, what was the rationale behind such strict segregation? I mean, we kind of understand it for alcohol because of pre-prohibition and everything, but why impose it in marijuana?
You know, I'm not really sure. When we talked with Allison Holcomb, who's the author of it, she said we wanted to mirror the alcohol beverage law, and that's why they did it. I mean, I don't know. I honestly don't know if it was a good idea or not. But
I think one of the things that when it was originally an initiative and it was written, they were intending for the state liquor stores to sell marijuana. So I think they were trying to mirror the system that we already had in place for liquor because they truly intended for those stores to sell the marijuana as well.
And one final quick question. When they handed out the dope at these meetings, did you guys smoke some when you came up with that logo?
it was given to the local police.
Not inhaled, huh?
Nice try, Matt.
Did you know there are over 2,000 strands of marijuana?
If you're going to sort of follow the liquor laws, you can make a head of household can make 200 gallons of wine without any permits or anything. Do you have any homegrown provisions for marijuana?
Colorado does. We do not. So the initiative does not allow individuals to have grows, which I'm not sure that was such a great idea because Colorado did it so that people could choose if they wanted to grow a small amount for themselves, but the initiative in Washington doesn't allow it.
In Colorado, I think you can grow like 6 plants
Yeah.
of your own, 3 of which can be budding, apparently, at the same time. So I hear.
I would like to ask about the deprivatization or the privatization of the liquor laws. Since there has been the change in the fee schedule for distributors, how does a new distributor get established in the state of Washington?
I think it's pretty limited now to them being able to get into the marketplace unless they're coming in with a new product or new supplier that isn't currently in the marketplace. So, you know, once they have franchise laws, I guess they could get out of their franchise agreements, but there's usually a penalty associated with that. So it'd be pretty difficult for a new supplier to come into the marketplace.
Jeff, we have
Or
a question.
distributors, excuse me.
We have a question over here in the suburbs.
Yeah, now that marijuana is legal in Washington, did you do any studies to see how it might impact sales revenue in other sin industries like wine sales or spirits?
We don't use that term.
They use it for the syntax. That's why I used it. But just curious if you have any short-term projections. Maybe it's not a big impact, but long-term?
Really have no idea. I think one of the things we all forget is people are smoking marijuana in Washington now. Honestly, when you look at what you're doing is you're moving to recreational where you can hold a license and you can possess we used a firm called Bowtech as our consultant, and they've shared with us, you're not going to see huge increases in people that are now going to experiment with marijuana because it's not that difficult to get, and they can experiment now. I mean, there may be a small jump, but literally, I mean, we'll see what happens in the next year once the stores are open. But I don't see, I guess the answer is, I don't see a huge difference because people who want to have both can do that now.
Is that something that Wine Institute thinks about?
We've thought about it. It's really more where it can be consumed in Washington. It can't be consumed in public premises, so it's not going to be something that could be consumed at the bar and stuff. So it's not going to take away, for example, from an on-premise sale any more than it currently is perhaps doing that. I mean, we're watching with interest.
Yeah, actually, the board is addressing by rule the ability for that a restaurant can't have marijuana consumed in a restaurant. So there have been 2 restaurants in Washington that have what they call a private club, and they are allowing for consumption of marijuana. So we're actually going through the rulemaking process, not through the marijuana rulemaking process, but through liquor licenses or rulemaking to address that licensee that sells liquor can't have consumption of marijuana in their establishments.
So one thing I didn't cover is what the law says is not in public view, quotes. So obviously, I guess in your home or in the backyard or whatever, but we've had a lot of, especially in Seattle, interest from folks who want to know whether the board would support legislation or policy that would allow for public consumption in bars and lounges. The law doesn't allow it. I don't think we're going to go there. I think it took 20 years in the state of Washington after Prohibition before you could even get a drink in public. So, anyway.
All right. I want to leave time for 1 or 2 more questions. We're running a little bit late, but we're just going to push the breakout sessions a little bit.
This is cool, though. I learned that if I'm on a pot panel, I don't have to answer any questions about wine, so it's kind of nice.
And
I've been searching for years.
And Steve, under the Constitution of this country, you don't have to.
Just wondering how you are going to have prices be competitive in the legal market and to encourage the illicit markets or deter them and to kind of gain that tax revenue.
I think that's going to be really difficult. It was one of the first questions we asked Allison Holcomb, the author. Why did you place such large taxes at 25% at each tier? Isn't it going to be difficult to compete? You know what she said? She said, it's weed. It isn't difficult to grow. It's not expensive to grow. The reason why it's overpriced today is because it's black market, and you will be able to compete at those levels. I'm not sure that we believe that in looking at this the last few months. I think you're going to have to, as I said earlier, you're going to have to regulate medical marijuana. Right now, anyone can get a card from a provider in Washington. We've heard estimates as much as 90% of those that consume in medical marijuana dispensaries and purchase are actually recreational users, because you meet the definition in Washington if you have acute pain. So you can imagine, not too tough to get a card. I think you pay $200. So that has to be properly regulated so that patients that actually need marijuana can get it, and you move the recreational user over.
Please give a round of applause to our fantastic panelists, Mr. Lou Bright as well.